Thank you all for being here this afternoon. I know you winding down after eating lunch and pastries and tons of coffee, so I definitely appreciate y'all hanging in there and joining us this afternoon. This session is titled "The Bug Stops Here, State of Georgia Shifts Left." We'll get into intros here now. My name is Jasmyne Epps, and I am the unit director at the state of Georgia, particularly the Office of Digital Services and Solutions. Oh, and let me go back because I did not hit the record button.
I hit it.
Oh, you hit it? Okay, great. All right, we're recording.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And let me move over and let my friend here, James, introduce himself.
Hey everybody, I'm James Stansbury. I'm CEO of Tugboat and formerly worked at Lullabot as an architect on the project, the Georgia project. So it's been an honor to work with Jasmyne over the years and excited to tell you what we've done. And this is my slide as well. So just a rundown of what we're doing. So, we're going to talk through a little bit about the GovHub project, the Georgia GovHub project, some of the challenges that the Georgia team had before Lullabot came on, and some of the challenges they had with their process. Then some of the solutions in terms of like how to shift left, how that changed and improved their software delivery lifecycle. Then I'm gonna take over a bit and just get nerdy for a little while. So during that period, hopefully like no eyes glaze over and stuff like that. We'll try to keep it fun. Don't worry. And then we'll just wrap it up with some takeaways and some question and response.
All right, well, let's get into it. So again, my name is Jasmyne Epps, and when I started with the state of Georgia a little over 10 years ago, I started as a QA analyst. So I was definitely in the weeds a lot, so I can tell you about all the pain points that we're going to talk about here today. But our platform, just a little bit about GovHub. It is a Drupal multi-site that now houses about 90 state agency websites. We have about 600 registered content editors. Over the last year, we've seen about 45 million site visits. Of those visits, there have been about 184 million page views, and of those page views, 49 million of them were engaged sessions. So engaged sessions are those that last a little longer than 10 seconds, have a conversion event, or have 2 or more screen or page views. And I'm really proud about that number because that means that constituents are searching for their content, usually starting with Google or some search engine, and landing on our sites exactly where they need to be. And that's just a testament to how well our sites are structured now that we have shifted left. Some of the agency partners include some big players like Department of Revenue, Department of Driver Services. So ours isn't called the DMV, it's called DDS. And so that really confuses people when they move to Georgia. The Georgia Department of Public Health. And we also have a couple of elected officials as well, the governor and the lieutenant governor. So every transformation starts with a little bit of pain. So we're going to start there. I don't know if any of you have ever driven to Atlanta or flown into Atlanta and experienced our traffic, but this is what it looks like every day. I'm not even going to say that we have a rush hour. It is just all day rush congestion. This particular image here is our connector. It connects 2 large interstates, Interstate 75 and 85, and goes right through downtown. So this is the main corridor that everyone takes to get in and out of the city, and so this is what it looks like every single day. And it is much like our legacy software development lifecycle experience, how there was just tons of congestion, tons of things in our backlog waiting to get out into production. And most of our sprint, as you can see with our legacy development lifecycle, was consumed with development work. A lot of what we were doing was figuring out whether or not the issue was addressed after it started to be worked on by the developer. So as you can see here, there was a little bit of light backlog refinement in the beginning, mostly just involving the product owner and the developer. Then that one developer would work on that issue, and one issue at a time, and push it over to our dev server. So this is how our team worked. We had a very lean team in the beginning, one product owner, one lead dev, and one lowly QA analyst, and that was myself. And so that developer would work on one issue at a time, push it to our dev server, and then once all of the issues were complete, then the QA would kick in, and I would perform manual regression testing as well as manually test each of those issues on our dev server. Now, going back to that traffic analogy, we only had one staging server. So that was one of our biggest issues as well. We only had one staging server. So we had, there was a lot of waiting for the developer to finish all the work in order for me to do the testing. And if all of the tests and all the regression passed on dev, great. We would deploy the staging and do that process all over again. But if the QA, myself, found issues, I had to kick all of it back to the developer, and I have to wait on them to figure out what line of code caused that issue, because it was all merged at that point, right? And maybe they would cherry pick that issue out of the code, or we just keep going and see if we can figure it out in the next environment and hope we didn't push any bugs into production. And that was pretty much our life. It was a lot of waiting until the last moment, really, to do the QA. And so what are some of the problems with delaying testing? There was a scramble at the end of each sprint to get the testing done. There was really no time to remediate any of those issues that we found. And so if we found issues, we had to weigh the option of delaying the sprint or delaying the release. And so the sprint velocity lagged significantly. And it was always like a whack-a-mole trying to figure out what caused the issue. If we merged all the code and then did the testing, it was really hard to identify which PR, pull requests, actually introduced that bug. And there was a lot of manual testing, like I said. Like, we didn't have any automation at that point. And so it was really hard to figure out where the problems were. And so it prolonged feature development. Like, our product got really stale, really fast, and we couldn't do all of the amazing things that we had waiting in the backlog. So this is live footage of me at the end of every sprint. I was just a wreck, stressed out. I had stayed up all night coding things and trying to figure out whether or not my testing was actually thorough enough, and hoping and praying that I didn't introduce any client-facing bugs into production. And then to top it all off, we had this insane process, if you want to call it. I wouldn't say it was necessarily a process, but on top of that, we were then faced with having to completely refactor our platform in order to migrate, at that point, 80 plus websites from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. The famous last words before the dread set in. And at the time, still, our product is very bespoke, it's very custom. So we were already not doing things the Drupal way. And then Drupal 7 and Drupal 8 completely upended the Drupal way. So we were just really at a loss of how to approach this migration. So some of the challenges, like I mentioned, were the significant breaking changes between Drupal 7 and Drupal 8. And like I said, because we were already really custom, we didn't even know where to start. And we also were kind of like a little bit of Wild Wild West with the user permissions. Like, some of our users had, a little bit more flexibility than others as far as their permissions, and even so that it left really no consistency between the sites. We had 80 plus sites. Some of our agencies had tons of content editors who were doing things differently within their organization. They didn't have their own established workflows. So some of those agencies also were doing things differently within their ecosystem. And it was just really hard to identify if we could write automated migration scripts to address all of those inconsistencies. And then we were already faced with a steadily increasing maintenance burden because we didn't have a solid process to how we rolled out feature development. And so our migration strategy then was unclear. Like, who do we migrate first? Do we migrate our large sites like Department of Labor and, those really highly visible sites that will really give us a good idea of how the landscape will be as we start to migrate everyone? Or do we start with like the little sites, like Lake Lanier? Have you guys ever heard of Lake Lanier? Yeah, they have a site too that has like 5 pages that no one ever looks at. And so we're like, let's start with them. They're really easy. That'll be quick. But that would not inform the rest of our landscape. So that was a question. Who do we migrate first? And then how do we address, again, the differences in the content amongst the agencies? So even though they all had kind of the same content types, they were using them for different purposes. They were trying to get around the guardrails that we were trying to set and kind of doing their own thing, especially when it came to the design. Y'all know that they all want to look different. They all want to look cool. And so they were doing really funky things with some of the content types that was not the intention. And, we also wanted to take this opportunity in the migration to address our processes, to see if there were ways that we could improve, not just from infrastructure standpoint, from a administrative and a operational standpoint. So the solution. We learned about this shifting left thing when we, at this point, decided to join forces with Lullaby. So what is shifting left? It is moving certain steps earlier in the software development lifecycle process, steps like backlog refinement, getting that stakeholder sign off, and incorporating automated and manual QA earlier on rather than the last 2 days of the sprint. So what are the opportunities that we saw that we could gain from implementing this shift left methodology? We thought maybe we should involve the stakeholders sooner in the process, and all of the stakeholders. One thing I forgot to mention earlier is that the development partner we were working with at the time also was doing development on their own server off to the side without really talking to us, and then I had to pull in their changes that they made and try to QA that and figure out if it was our code or what they did, and it was just really no visibility, no clear visibility in what was going on. And so involving the stakeholders sooner was an opportunity, including QA. QA also was not included in the backlog refinement. So it wasn't totally clear or accurate as to how long an actual ticket would take, because you have to incorporate that testing time as well. And we weren't doing that. It was just like, whatever, QA, do it once we're done. And so doing so, involving all the development partners, the QA stakeholders, as well as the PM and our lead engineer early, it prevented a lot of rework after deployment. And it allowed us to confirm that acceptance criteria really early on. So everyone knew what constituted done for a ticket. And that led to less scope creep. Also, performing QA sooner, and not just manual, but incorporating automated tests as well, it gave us a chance to identify and remediate the bugs early rather than waiting until the end of the sprint with no time to remediate those bugs. And ultimately introduce them into production, which happened a lot of hot fixes early on. And that provided a much better test coverage and better quality code. And testing each PR as it became available, rather than waiting to test them all on one single server, drastically improved our development workflow. And that's where Tugboat came in. So Tugboat was the real game changer for our very lean team. So adding Tugboat removed the bottleneck from having a single staging server and eliminated the congestion of waiting until every bit of code was merged. And so, yes, it was very like Oprah moments. Everyone getting their own server. And this is what our shift left methodology changed to. So as you can see, that feedback loop, let me use the laser pointer. The feedback loop there happened way earlier in the process. And because a lot of times we were able to catch those bugs on the Tugboat preview, there weren't any instances where we were moving bugs across to other environments. So if you notice in the first workflow, I had a like yes, no kind of flow chart thing, but here there are no no's because the code and everything was checked thoroughly when we used those Tugboat previews. And so when we moved to staging, we were confident that we were not introducing bugs at that point. And so rarely did we have any bugs introduced into production. Sometimes I would say main bugs came from updating core. Like especially when we have like such a custom implementation, there's some things that we may not have accounted for that core was breaking in our custom code. And so that is something that we may not have been able to catch on Tugboat. But for the most part, we caught those things very early, and that was a major upgrade to our workflow. So the devs could get feedback immediately from QA rather than waiting to the very end of the sprint. And QA was able to start testing immediately rather than waiting till the end of the sprint. And as a result, the handoff between QA and the developers was at a Usain Bolt pace. We were off to the races. And it was just a much better workflow and environment, really. Less stress and crying under my desk. So some of the QA strategies, too, that we decided to deploy in this effort were Selenium-driven automated regression tests. So in the beginning, we used a tool called Qtest. And then I went to a conference and someone told me about Catalan Studios. So we were using Catalan Studios, and that was really cool, too. It allowed you to kind of like click and build the test. So we basically would mimic an editor's experience and get that kind of regression testing automated. But we also used BHAT tests to automate automated regression testing using BHAT for the code. And right now we're actually in the process of migrating from BHAT to Playwright. So maybe I can talk about that at another time. And a part of Tugboat that was really cool that we were kind of doing with Browser Stack, where we could pull up our sites and real devices and kind of check the front end, but then that required us to remember what the front end looked like before the last release, and so that actually added more time to the QA process. So instead, we turned to Tugboat for the visual regression as well. And so there were thresholds you can set that will say whether or not the issue is passed or failed. And sometimes those failed ones would be expected because we were changing something on the front end. So of course, it's going to look different from the last release. But it allowed us to see what those things were and go and check, and it made that process much faster. And so we just limited the manual QA of each PR to just what was being changed. So if we were implementing a new button or changing something on a node edit form, we would manually QA that to just make sure that the acceptance criteria of the issue was met. And then just the very act of establishing acceptance criteria, everyone being involved in that process and understanding the work to be done was also a new strategy that we could deploy because we had all these other mechanisms that could speed up our development. So after deploying all of these methods, the path just became much more clear to migrating the sites. It accelerated our processes, it provided more test coverage, the cross-team collaboration became much easier, and so we were much more confident now in our ability to move from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 and move all these sites and it not be so much of a disruption to our customers because that's our main concern. So, just to recap, the challenge that we experienced before was poorly executed software development lifecycle processes, just really none to begin with, and just kind of doing what we could with the lean team that we had. And we just didn't feel like we were providing the best value to our constituents through this product. And due to the lack of processes, automation, and stakeholder involvement, it really just became impossible to scale. Like we couldn't even do all the cool stuff that Drupal offered. And so the solution became we matured to a shift left methodology and moved a lot of those processes earlier on in our workflow. And we incorporated Tugboat into our DevOps toolset. And that was really the catalyst that we needed to deliver better code and to just really address all of our processes. We saw what was possible with this technology of Tugboat, and it really just opened our eyes to making our processes better. So, with that, I will let James tell you all the technical.
Thank you. Yeah, so like I said, we're going to get nerdy here for a little bit, but we're going to keep it fun. So, just some context to start with. So let's talk about GovHub Stack a little bit. So for, as we've talked about, GovHub is Drupal multi-site. And in this environment, one of the critical things was having a consistent scripting process as far as like how to run scripts across all these different environments. And we, after kind of like evaluating a lot of different tools, we decided to go with Drush actually for the build runner, the task runner. And we were using some of the more advanced features inside of Robo. Robo is built into Drush, such as rollbacks. And we're also using GNU Parallel to load balance these tasks across multiple webheads. Since this is Drupal multi-site, you've got a lot of tasks that need to run on individual websites, so being able to kind of load balance that across was really helpful. The repository is hosted on Bitbucket, and we're also hosting some private Docker images, and those are hosted on Red Hat Key. For local environments, we're using DDEV. It started as Lando, and now we're using DDEV. For CI testing, we're using CircleCI. And as we mentioned, for pull request previews using Tugboat, the production site is hosted on Acquia. So one of the first things to think about if you're thinking about shifting left for your own organization is how are you going to handle data? Because one of the things we're going to touch on here is the importance of testing with as real as possible real data. And so to start with, let's talk about the data handling process that we did for GovHub. And we had several things that we wanted to focus on here. And first and foremost, we needed a secure process, right? So we're going to touch on how to create a secure process for sharing, real data across all these environments. And we really wanted this to be an efficient process for the entire team, the development team and the stakeholders, QA folks, everybody. And as mentioned, we want that data parity across all these environments. So, it's not just using real data on staging sites, but like all the way down the line, how can we use as real data as possible? So first up, let's talk about security, right? So a lot of folks are sanitizing the data that they're getting, right? Which is good. We see a lot of teams doing this, but the way that they're doing it usually is they're pulling down real data to a local environment or something like that, and then hopefully running some sort of sanitization script to go through and remove any sort of sensitive data. And if you're doing that on your local environment, is that really a secure process? I see some shaking of heads. No. So yeah, kind of like the whole from the get-go, we wanted to make sure these processes were running inside the secure boundary. So we created those sanitized database dumps on Acquia, and then we're provisioning them from there. Another thing that we see a lot is that people aren't testing with real data. And the thing about real data is it's messy. And if you're testing with test data, it's usually like a normalized bit of data that, it's going to like meet certain criteria already because you're just basically creating the data to solve the acceptance criteria, right? And so, for example, if you're writing a migration script and you can see okay, PDFs, I can migrate PDFs now. That's great. What happens if you have over 500,000 PDFs? The thing is going to break down. The servers are going to melt. It's going to take 30 days to run the script. So when you have real data available and you try to test that migration, you're going to realize, oh, I've got to think about this a different way. I've got to approach this a different way. So the way we solved this for GovHub is we made Docker images that already had all the source data for the migration already available in them. And as well, there were destination database images as well. So if there were sites that were already migrated over and someone was working on those sites, you've already got Docker images there with the data, the sanitized data that you need to implement that new feature, fix that bug, that sort of a thing. And if you're trying to do this on your own, you can use the Tugboat QA Docker images, even if you're not using Tugboat. These images are already set up to be able to store, MySQL databases inside of them and that sort of a thing. So this allows us, once we have these Docker images, to use the same Docker images throughout that whole process up until you get to actual production infrastructure. So just to recap some of the data handling piece, on the security side of things, making sure unsanitized data never leaves that secure boundary. And that also allows you to have better access control over your production environment. Normally what we see is teams are allowing their contractors, their engineers, to have access to production infrastructure that they really don't need if you've got these things available, if you sanitize the data and then make it available somewhere offsite. In terms of efficiency, what this means much faster onboarding for new team members too. So you bring on a contractor or something like that, and you have these Docker images, you just provide them access to the Docker images, and then whatever local development tool they're using, under the hood, it's just doing a Docker pull for that, and then you've got a local set up and running, and you don't need to figure out like, oh, which database dump do I need to get, and is this most recent, and that sort of a thing. It's just all there and ready to go. And so this also really simplifies the development experience as well for the development team. And that feature parity, the data parity across all the different environments, all testing throughout that entire phase is testing with real data, real sanitized data. And it avoids that whole it worked on my local sort of paradigm, where it's like, why did this break? It totally worked for me. And then once it gets on, an environment with real data, you realize it doesn't work anymore. So, yeah, so that's the data handling piece. Now we're going to shift over to some of the actual testing strategy. So let's talk about that a bit. We're going to talk about it in 3 different areas. So we're going to talk about it for local environments, for CI environments, and for those Tugboat environments. Or if you're not using Tugboat, any sort of pre-production testing environment. And the whole goal of this is to move all left. We're talking about is shifting those steps onto these environments that are before the merge happens. Because once you merge a bug in, it's exponentially more expensive to fix it. And it takes longer to find it, as Jasmine was talking about. You're not sure which PR broke what thing, that sort of a thing. So to start with, let's look at local. You may think shift left, so we're just going to shift left and then we'll shift left one more and shift left one more. But no, actually start with your local environments first. And the reason for that, what we've seen a lot of times happen is you have these automated tests or whatever sort of tests you have set up, and they start failing for some reason. And maybe it's not an actual bug that's in the pull request or something. And it can be really challenging to try to debug those things in a CI environment or something like that. And so, you're in crunch time and the team will just be like, well, let's just comment out that test. We'll just disable that one so we can unblock the release and get this through. I'm watching people groan in the audience, so yeah. You feel my pain. So make sure all of your tests can run on the local environments first, so that way if something breaks, you can test it on your local. Developer can get in there with a debugger and see okay, here's actually why this is failing, let's fix this test, get it back up and running. And in addition to this, on your local environments, one thing we did for GovHub is if you have fast automated tests, for example, linting. Linting is a very fast test. Run those tests on every commit. Run those fast automated tests locally on every single commit. The tool we used for this for GovHub is a tool called GrumPHP. They've got like a picture of like a grumpy guy. It's kind of a little silly, but yeah. So on local environments, what it does is you run, if a developer runs git commit, it'll run through all those linting tests automatically on those commits locally, and that's going to catch a bunch of stuff before it ever gets to a CI environment, and that'll save not just time, that'll actually save money too, because you might not realize you have a linting error, you push that up to a CI environment, and then you're spending all these minutes for these things to run, and someone realizes, oops, I had a little syntax error, and let me push up a new commit, and all those tests need to run again, right? So this is what GrumPHP looks like. This is a little small, I apologize for that, but what's going on at the top here is a git commit command, and then in the middle here, we've got all the different linting steps that happen, and these are all really fast. So this doesn't take very long. And then since I'm a Mr. Rogers fan, I wanted to make it, instead of it being a GrumPHP thing, I wanted it to be a little happier and lighter. So we have a Mr. Rogers quote here, "You are special if the tests pass." And likewise, if the tests fail, you've got another Mr. Rogers quote, "Be brave, be strong." It kind of cycles through random quotes and stuff. So yeah, so that's a local environment. You know, just to kind of recap there, make sure you're running fast tests on local environments. Make sure all of your tests can run, automated tests can run on your local environment. So if you do run into snags, you can debug those locally. So moving over to CI, if you're already have a CI environment, continuous integration, and automated tests, this is not going to be anything groundbreaking here for you. But what we're going to do for this, we're going to run all those linting tests again that we've already run on local environments. And this allows you to also, there are some linting tests that can be a little bit slower than others, or you can set up some tests that maybe are a little stricter for certain tests. So you can set that up here in the continuous integration environment. And then for the other tests, this is your typical testing pyramid here. So you've got your base of unit tests, and then integration tests on top of that, and then the end-to-end tests on top of that. So for GovHub, that's BHAT for the end-to-end tests, and moving over to Playwright for that. So that's the CI testing. So moving over to Tugboat. So if you're not familiar with Tugboat, we've kind of touched on it briefly here a little bit, but it spins up a fully working website for every pull request. And one of the cool things that it does is it actually performs a merge before it builds that preview. So one thing you can run into is, like, let's say I'm a developer, I grab a ticket, I create a new branch, but maybe I haven't updated my main branch with whatever other commits have happened there. So I'm doing this work, but I don't have all the other changes that are in the main branch. So Tugboat, what it does is it's going to merge that new branch to the target branch, and then it's going to run all those build steps. And that process in and of itself will catch so many bugs that are due to the fact that maybe the main branch has moved ahead, and so, you know, developer A did some work that developer B, you run into an issue where it's, oh, it didn't work. Why is it broken? Oh, it's because I didn't have these changes in my branch. So then the developer can go back and try to fix those before it actually ever gets to a staging server or a production server. And then from there, you know, as Jasmine mentioned, manual QA can happen here, user acceptance testing, and some folks even use Tugboat environments for running end-to-end tests. So what I'm going to do here for a bit here is just look at, like, what does a Tugboat configuration look like. And if you're familiar with Docker Compose, it looks very similar to a Docker Compose file, but it does have some additional things inside of it. So it's got things for, like, build stages, and it's got support for proxying for multi-site, and it's got, like we showed, you know, it's got a place to configure visual regression testing URLs. So we're going to take a look at some actual config files here. some YAML, and so this is the GovHub YAML file. It's very small. You don't actually need to read it. I'm just kind of showing you like what it looks like. And right here are these different build stages. So you have certain commands that can run to initialize. You've got commands that can run to pull down fresh data, such as like fresh database dumps and that sort of thing. And then the actual build steps, which would be anything that, any of the Drupal tasks that need to run, such as clearing caches and running database updates, that sort of thing. Or if you've got CSS compilation steps that need to happen, those can all happen in the build phase. We've got docs.tugboatqa.com has a lot of different boilerplate config files you can look at there as well if you're getting set up on your own. And as I mentioned, there's support for multi-site in there. So let's take a look at what multi-site config looks like. So inside of the config, you can set up different aliases for any given service that is defined. And here you've got all the different aliases. Think of an alias as like a different URL that you get. So you can have, in a multi-site example, we've got the Department of Revenue, for example, is right there, right? And so then what Tugboat does is it'll create a unique URL for each one of those aliases there. So, and then if you're familiar with how multi-site works in Drupal, you've got this phsites.php file where you can map these things to say like, okay, that points to this site, that sort of a thing. So that allows you to test multi-site inside of Tugboat. You can test multiple different sites as well. So, and once that's set up, let's take a look at what it looks like to configure visual regression testing. So it's pretty simple here. You can just list out what URLs you want to test. And these URLs are for, this is a little confusing, but the site itself is called test. So this is one of the aliases. If I go back here, you can see it down there at the bottom. Right here is the test alias. And this is a separate site that GovHub has, the GovHub team has, that has all of their storybook components and stuff set out into different pages so that they can run visual regression testing across different landing pages, different sample content and stuff like that. So you can test with static data, so you're not testing, doing visual regression testing with data that might be moving around. So. Or maybe even the data that doesn't exist. Sometimes you create a component and nobody ever uses it. And so then once that's set up, this is what that looks like inside of the Tugboat UI. You can see here we've got a total of 120 URLs that are tested, 116 passed, and then these 4 failures are highlighted here. And so the typical workflow is a project manager or QA engineer would see, oh, this pull request, the visual regression testing failed. Let me go check out what's going on. And so they would click on one of these, and they'd be taken to a page like this. And you can see over here is a screenshot of the before. So this is before the code was merged in. And then this is the after screenshot. And if you look closely, let me back up. Over on the before screenshot, we have a map showing up, and on the after screenshot, the map is not showing up. And so this could be indicative of a legitimate bug. Maybe this is a regression in this pull request where the map integration got broken somehow. Or it could be indicative of a false positive where the Google Maps integration, maybe there was a access or an API key that needs to be rotated or something like that. Or there was, Google Maps just had a networking issue at that point. And so, maybe it's something where someone comes in and, well, you could click regenerate if you think it's just an anomaly. Or you can say, no, this is an expected change. Let's go ahead and approve this. As Jasmine was mentioning before, you click approve, and then we get happy green check marks. We love happy green check marks. And so then this would show up on Bitbucket, GitHub as well, so or GitLab or wherever you're hosting. So yeah, that was that's a lot of the technical stuff. Actually, there's a ton more that I could talk about. I just kind of wanted to hit some of the highlights there. But just to recap some, as far as the setup is concerned, again, create those sanitized dumps in secure environments and make sure that that data is then used consistently across all of the environments that you have, local, CI, Tugboat, wherever you're able to use that data. And script everything. Make sure that all the scripts are running on every environment consistently. That's a big thing that we run into where it's like, well, why didn't this release go smoothly? And it's like, well, you've got this completely different process you were using in production than you're using in any other environment. So you didn't catch that bug there because you're not using the same scripts everywhere else. As far as the environments are concerned, on local environments, run those fast tests on every commit and ensure all those tests can run on local environments. So you're not running into that scenario where you need to debug something or just disable something in order to get a release out the door. For CI environments, run those linting, unit tests, end-to-end tests, integration tests there. And then on Tugboat, the huge game changer here is being able to QA and user acceptance testing before the merge happens. So yeah, let's talk switch over. We'll do some key takeaways here and then do some of the question and response.
Yeah. So yeah, a couple of key takeaways for me are standardize your processes at every level, like including stakeholders in the very beginning of the process, all of your stakeholders, standardizing your backlog refinement process, your sprint planning process, just everything, and make sure that you adhere to those processes throughout. And like I mentioned, involving the stakeholders early and often. Like anyone who is needed in making a decision, include them early on in the process so that you don't get to the end and deploy something that actually was not what they were expecting.
Yeah, and testing everything you can before merging in code will be an absolute game changer for your organization. So you're making sure that only things, what it does is it gives you a continuous delivery workflow. The main branch could be all deployed at any day, basically, any moment you want to. So everything that's merged in has already been tested. And I can't emphasize enough using that real data for testing. You're going to catch so many things once you get that set up. You're going to catch things that you just didn't expect. All right, so any questions you all have about really anything about the process or GovHub? Jasmine, you can ask anything about Jasmine. Yes, Matthew.
I have a question. When you're talking about the Docker images, so the same, do you mean you're using the same Docker image on Acquia, Tugboat, and DDEV?
So the question was about the Docker images. Are the Docker images being used across DDEV? What else did you say? Acquia,
DDEV, and Tugboat?
Acquia, DDEV, and Tugboat. So that we're not using, obviously we're not using Docker images on Acquia, or maybe that's something Acquia's added at this point. But no, Acquia is kind of its own thing. So they're using the actual MySQL data directly running on the server. MySQL is running on this separate database servers. But then any other environment, basically any environment where you're using Docker, have Docker images ready to go for that. So, and I will say this isn't something that all projects we do this. This is just something that we did here, and it really helped out on the migrations process because being able to have Docker images that have the source data available for the sites that were being migrated in that round meant that it simplified the process for the engineers to be able to say, okay, I'm working on this next round of migrations. I pull down the Docker image for that. I've already got all the source data there for me to start that. So,
I have
yes.
a question. You mentioned you mentioned you moved away from BHAT to Playwright. Why did you do that?
So the question was, why did we move our automated testing from BHAT to Playwright? So That decision came as a result of an attempt to save like our CI, like our CircleCI, CircleCI minutes. Just running the BHAT test became a little longer, so we were introduced by Lullaby the idea of moving our tests to Playwright that also included visual regression, so we could just save a little time in running our tests.
And your multi-sites, so all of your sites are like the same code base and with separate, so all 60 are sharing the same code base.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so the question was, are all of our sites on GovHub sharing the same code base? And yes, they're all sharing the same code base, but they are in control of their own content, so they each have their own databases for the content. Yes.
I'm curious, how are you handling very large sites like that have upwards of 500 or 1,000 pages?
Yeah, so the question was, how do we handle our large sites? In what capacity? Like
Both from
the
a
storage?
QA, because you've got this now visual automated QA, right?
Yeah.
But also just like the managing, just like making sure all the content, right, is accurate. And I'm assuming you're doing some sort of sample set, right?
Yeah, so that's where Tugboat helps too. We have a few, and you saw in the config file that there were a few sites that were generating previews. So there are some sites that we know are doing things a little differently, or they're just like a very highly visible site that we want to make sure didn't break. So like DOR, DDS, DOL, like those are some big sites. So we do have Tugboat previews for them. So we'll go and check certain content displays that we know are unique to their sites. Make sure that the My Drive app link is showing up on the DDS site because that's a huge driver for their business. Things like that. So we do have some manual checks for certain sites, but for the most part, they are responsible for their own content. We do not check the content, and the guardrails that we put up are really standardizing those content types so that they can't do too much out of the norm that we would have to really keep an eye on. So all of the content types work the same, they display the same. There's no opportunity for them to like trick them into doing something else and displaying it a different way. We took all that away. So that's kind of how we keep a wrap on that. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
So the Tugboat previews, I know they're useful for your team internally, and do you ever find yourselves using those previews for like agency stakeholders, or like to preview changes for them?
Yeah. So the question was, do we use the Tugboat previews outside of our internal use and use them for stakeholder verification? The answer is no. We do not want them to know we have Tugboat. Because if they did, they would be like, yo, we split up a Tugboat and look at this and look at that. So no, we try not to even let them know we have Tugboat. It is just for internal use, and it's just to speed up our processes. So each site has a staging site. So we tell them, hey, you want to look at some stuff, stage it on your staging site. But we do let them know that staging is overridden often, so it's just for you to play around with, but don't expect it to be there like tomorrow or next week or something like that. So no, we don't. Hope that they don't watch this session. So.
Do agencies contribute code to the code base for your multi-site, or is that only GTA or digital services folks?
Yeah, the question was, do our customers contribute code to our code base? No, they don't. But if we build something that came out of an agency requirement, we try to analyze whether or not we should contribute it back to Drupal. So in one instance, we contributed back type train. If you go and look at that module, that's a module that our team came up with, or with the help of Lullaby, of course. It's a display of our content types to kind of help them to guide our agencies of what content type to choose when they're trying to select like what content to make and what would be the best content type for it. So it's called type train. So we built that with our agencies in mind, but then we contributed back to Drupal. Yeah.
So by shifting left, you're doing QA and UAT before you merge the PR on Tugboat, and you fix problems, that passes. You're still, at that point, it goes to stage and you redo the QA and UAT there as well, and then it goes to prod and you do it there as well?
Yes. Yeah. So the question was just a little bit about our process. We do all of the validation, as much validation as we can, catching bugs on Tugboat. So that way, when we move to staging, that takes like maybe a couple hours of QA, just like rechecking those PRs, making sure they still work, and running our automated regression. So a process that took like 2 or 3 days, like the whole day for the QA, is now taking like a couple hours.
One more follow-up question.
Yeah.
Were you able to then, are you releasing more often with smaller releases now that this process is more efficient?
Yes, so the question was, are we releasing more often with smaller releases? Yes, so we always try to adhere to a 2-week sprint schedule, but like I said, sometimes it would get delayed, and then the sprint would be like 3 weeks or 4 weeks or something like that. So now we're on a more consistent 2-week sprint schedule with releases every 2 weeks, but the biggest thing is we're able to do more in those releases. We're able to release more at a time than we were before. So rather than like 2 or 3 tickets going in, we're doing like 10, 12 tickets a sprint. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank y'all so
Thank you.
much. Thank y'all for coming.